13 and 14. When the Hebrews saw the Egyptians following them as they approached the Red Sea, they became very critical of Moses. Moses, listening to the guidance of the Lord within him, said to them, "Fear not. Wait and see the salvation the Lord will perform for you today. The Egyptians you have seen today, you will see no more. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace," meaning hold your tongue. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Lift up your staff and then stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the sea." I invite you to join me in using the creative power of the spoken word. Read with me out loud from the screen. Despite the lack of evidence and seeming barrenness of what I desire, I now prepare for my expanded good. Because I prepare, I am open mentally to recognize it and accept it as it comes to me. I am grateful. It is mine now. Thank you.
So this month we are delving into the prosperity secrets that are revealed as a mystical code or a metaphysical code in this great story of Moses. Probably the key person, leader, whatever, in the entire Old Testament. And this beautiful story of Exodus is not only inspiring in and of itself, there's a mystical code in it for our own freedom. And it's a movement of freedom from thinking that outer things are our source. The right relation, when we think the right relationship is our source, or the right, or if I get that job, then everything's going to be okay. If I get this or that or the other. And we begin to instead realize that everything happens from the inside out, that within us is the very source of all that is, the presence of God itself. And so we begin then, this is a journey of the heart, if you want to put it that way, from thinking that the answers are out there to realizing they're in here, because this is where the kingdom of heaven resides within each one of us, the kingdom of God itself. So, that beautiful passage that we just heard. Today we're going to be talking about the prosperity law of fearlessness. Prosperity law of fearlessness. And it's so well exemplified not only by the parting of the Red Sea experience. They think about it. After all of the plagues and everything that Moses put upon the Egyptian people because Pharaoh would not set them free, he finally set the Israelites free, the Hebrews free, and Moses and all of them are headed toward the Red Sea, and they bump up to the Red Sea. It looks like an impossible thing, and all they can think in their own minds is, oh my gosh, we're either going to walk in and drown, or we're going to be killed by the army of the Pharaoh, because the Pharaoh changed his mind and sent the army after them. So again, as we look at this story, it's important that we look at what is the metaphor, what is this teaching us about our own lives. So we'll be delving with that, but we also will be looking at the story of So once they cross the Red Sea, then they're in this barren wilderness, and there are 2 million of them. And where are they going to get all the food? They're used to doing hard labor, slave labor, to get their food and to receive their food in Egypt. And now they're on their own in the wilderness, 2 million of them. It's estimated that to feed them each day it would take 1,500 pounds of food, tons, 1,500 tons of food. And to give them enough water, it would be 11 million gallons a day, because they also had livestock with them. So it was them and their livestock. So think about it. These are examples of seemingly impossible things to overcome. How often do you find yourself in what seems like an impossible situation? An obstacle that you look at it and you think, there's no way I'm going to get through this. Well, what this story teaches is that there's always a way, and there's always a way when we turn within and make connection with the divine, with God within, and seek for our answers within ourselves instead of externally in the world, instead of looking at the appearance of something and saying, oh, it can't be done. So let's return. I want to do a little bit of review from last week, because I think it's really important to lay the groundwork again, just to remind ourselves that Moses had 3 major periods in his life of his own spiritual development. The first period, and they broke it into 40-year periods, saying that he lived to 120, and whether he did or not, it doesn't matter. What we need to remember is that these stories were told by mystics whose purpose was not to give you the exact facts of what happened, but whose purpose was to teach metaphysical codes, spiritual laws for our own lives. So keep in mind, that was the purpose of these spiritual teachings. So the Hebrews, the people who wrote these, the mystics, used exaggeration. They used symbolism. They used things like the number 40, which is what I'm going to be using in a moment. 40, which means all the time it takes for transformation. So when they divided his life into 40 years, Moses' life into 40 years, each period stood for the time it took him to move through a certain level of consciousness to another level of consciousness. So the first 40 years then, when he was in Egypt, think about it. He was originally a Hebrew. His mother put him in a basket down the water. He was drawn out of the water. And he was adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh. So he actually became the adopted grandson of Pharaoh. So he was surrounded in opulence and prosperity as he grew up. That was what he was used to. That was the norm. He was also, as all royal people were in that time, taught the spiritual laws of prosperity, the secrets, which were kept just to the royalty and to the high priests. They weren't shared with the masses back then. And he was taught all of these secrets. And one of the key secrets is that substance is the key to all abundance. So they were taught that there was a substance, an energy that fills all of the inner spaces of all form and in our own being, and we are made of that original substance, which is the divine. And that our word makes an impression, or impresses, it makes a mold for that substance to then become form. They learned these principles. So he had access to these great wisdom teachings. And so and this is how Pharaoh made his millions. But think about it, his billions. Think about it, though. What was the missing key in this particular thing? This is like the manifestor stage in the development of consciousness. There's first the victim stage where we think life is happening to me, but then we move into the manifestor stage where we learn the laws of prosperity. But what happens is we can get caught up in materialism if we just stay there. It's important to have that stage to learn how to stabilize our lives, to have the income flow so that we can get on to the more important things, which is making our contribution to the world. So it's important to know these laws in order to have well-established, healthy lives so we can give our gifts and talents. So we don't want to denigrate that. It's important to have that understanding. So what happened then in those 40 years then, and here's a great example of what happened, is he ended up using force. When he saw the Israelites being mistreated, he used force. He killed the guard who was mistreating the Hebrews, and so he was banished. So he used force, and we're going to learn that that is kind of the issue with staying stuck just in that stage of manifester, is that we end up trying to force things to happen. Yeah, we do it through our minds, but there's a higher level, and it's God through me. And there's one yet more, God as me. So you can call that first stage manifester. The next stage, though, was the next 40 years of his life, which was in the Midian desert, where he developed mystic consciousness, where he spent a lot of time in the silence, listening to the inner voice of the divine, which Jehovah actually means the God within. He made that personal connection with God within his very own being, and that I am presence spoke to him. That's our intuition. And there was a shift of identity then from being separate from the divine and God being out there somewhere to realizing I am one with God. I am of the one source, and that presence lives within me as well as within all life. And that he had a new identity, that I am presence. Knowing himself as pure spirit, the divine I am, was his next level of movement. Finally, the 40 years, he was living and teaching the principles that he had learned in both of these two stages to the Hebrew people. So he was making his contribution to the world. He was stepping out because he had stabilized everything else in consciousness. He'd gained the inner strength, he'd gained the faith and the trust and the deep connection with the divine, the wide open heart, which by the way, think of Pharaoh. One of the things he had the hardened heart, remember? He could manifest like crazy, but his heart was hard. That love and compassion for other people was missing. So that's what Moses developed in his Midian desert years. So now with that as the background, what I want to share then is these two stories, the Red Sea story and the story about what they did to feed themselves, or how did they feed all of those 2 million people. So here's the principle that I want you to look at that's underlying all of this. When you are only willing to do what is easy, life is hard. When you're only willing to do what is easy, life is hard. But when you do what is hard, and we're talking about facing our fears, then life becomes much easier. So facing what causes us fear, those seeming obstacles in our lives, is the way that we then transcend. So Moses was afraid of Pharaoh. He was terrified of him. And even after he'd done a lot of this deep inner work in the Midian desert, when he was asked to go and set the Hebrews free by the inner divine, the voice of Jehovah within him, he balked. And what did he come up with? He said, I can't do it. Essentially, this is what he said. I can't do it. It's too hard because I have a speech impediment. Right? I mean, that's essentially what he said. I can't do it. It's too hard. And so when we face our fears, there is a tendency to make excuses as to why we can't do it. We can come up with all kinds of excuses: too young, too old, not smart enough. not enough money. You can come up with all kinds of excuses as to why you don't move forward with that inner guidance to do what is yours to do in the world. So Moses then overcame that fear by having his brother Aaron go with him and do the speaking when was necessary. And Aaron, again, all of these, and when you look at the deeper code of what all of this means, the name Aaron means strength. So he's symbolic of relying on the strength of God within to move through and become fearless in the face of what normally scares us. So then what happened next? He had to go back over and over again, like 10 times, before Pharaoh finally set the Hebrews free. And each time there was a plague. Pharaoh, again, stands for an aspect of ourselves. Often we'll say, well, I know who Pharaoh sounds like. He sounds like that person in the world. We can come up with who we think Pharaoh is. But the truth is, the Pharaoh in us is that self-centered ego that wants to do it my way without God. I just want to do it my way. And is hard-hearted and doesn't have the compassion for self or for others that is necessary. So he had to continue to come back over and over again and ask for freedom from this ruling despot of and think of it in our own lives. Those negative thought patterns that we have, those ideas of separation, those ideas of wanting to force things to happen, wanting power over other people, whatever they might be. These are all things that have been conditioned in us, and so we don't want to be hard on ourselves because it's all part of the social conditioning in our culture to act in that way. And yet, what happened is Moses came back over and over and over again, and finally kept, and that's what we do every time we affirm the higher truth, that God is my source and supply, and I'm richly supplied. When we continue those high affirmations of truth, we begin to work at all of those old patterns of thinking and believing and that old identity of separation, and begin to stand in our truth so that we can be of benefit in the world. So he did the fearless thing. He kept going back and kept persisting. So the persistence is such a key point here, because as Ernest Holmes says, he says it so beautifully. He said, we cannot make affirmations for 15 minutes and spend the other 23 hours and 45 minutes denying the thing that we affirmed and obtain the results that we seek. We send out the word, and it sets in motion the power of God. But if we begin to think the opposite thing, it neutralizes the word and destroys any possibility of its effect. So if we persist with our affirmations of higher truth, God is my source and supply, and that presence is within me, and I am richly supplied with ideas, with solutions, with resources, with you can go on and on and on. As we continue to persist in this speaking of the truth, then miracles do occur. But it is a commitment, and that's sometimes why when people first get into this teaching, they go, "Oh wow, so this means that I need to be mindful of what goes through my mind all the time," and it's to the greatest extent possible, and so the key is just like the Hebrews who kind of had 40 years in the wilderness, where their minds were going up and down. One moment they were complaining and criticizing Moses, and the next minute they were grateful, and they get back in line, and then they were out of line, and they were in line. That's what happens on our journey as we begin to practice these high affirmations of truth and deepen our connection with God, is that we tend to slip. and we just bring ourselves back. So the key is to not get discouraged, but to keep at it and keep at it and keep at it over and over again. And we've learned that probably the highest affirmation that we can use to wield our power, and remember the rod of power that Moses used when he lifted it, and when we use I am statements, I am the life of God individualized. I am love. I am peace. I am joy. I am a beneficial presence. When we do those high affirmations and we're using our divine power for good to establish ourselves in that higher identity. I just heard something actually on the internet recently where there was a presentation on how to affect really lasting change. It was interesting. This is just this man talking, and he said, if we think that when we change our environment, that things are going to change. In other words, if we just get a new job or whatever, then life will change. If we think that if we change our behaviors, then our life will change. And I don't know how many of you have tried to just change your behavior, but find yourself slipping back. If we change our beliefs, yeah, there can be some change. But then if we change our values, yeah, it gets even better. But then the highest level of true lasting change is identity. Knowing that we are the divine, individualized. We are sons and daughters of the Most High. As we step into that identity, that I am identity, that's when lasting change takes place. So yes, we work on changing our beliefs and so on, but it's that identity, identifying ourselves as sons and daughters of the Most High, that truly is our ticket to freedom. So when Pharaoh finally agrees to set the Israelites free and changes his mind, and the Israelites are now confronted with the Red Sea, that huge obstacle that seems that their end is near, Moses then uses the power of his word, stretches his rod, stretches out his hand, and divides the sea. And the Israelites cross, and then as the Egyptians pursue, they drown in the process. What is the symbolism here? Think about it. So as we meet our obstacles, as we then remember to turn to higher truth, turn to the divine, to meet those obstacles in creative ways. We're given creative ways to meet them. The seas of the obstacles part, and we walk right on through. Okay, so the Egyptians then stand for those old habit patterns of thinking that pursue us. Doesn't it feel sometimes like those old habit patterns, that negative thinking pursues us? At times it feels that way. Think of those as the Egyptians. And the Egyptians are washed away. The habit patterns are washed away. You can think of the water as by high affirmation, by knowing the truth of who we are and keeping our eye on the vision and moving forward, not looking at the appearance of what's going on and saying, "Oh my gosh, it's not happening. Look around me. I'm seeing lack everywhere. How can, that's looking down." One of the things, I went to a celebration of one of Center for Spiritual Living Berks County yesterday, and Reverend Bob Dean, one of my dear friends, spoke. And he talked about the experience of fire walking. And he had not intended to do it all, but he did it. But he said what he was told by John Waterhouse is, because John Waterhouse was standing on the other side, he said, he had everybody ground themselves in their vision. He said, "Look at me and think of your vision and do not look down. Because if you look down, you'll burn your feet." So that was the key, is to keep the eye on the vision and move forward. And the people who looked down got blisters on their feet. The people who kept their eye on the vision. So think about that as a great metaphor too. The Israelites had to keep their minds on the land of milk and honey, that great promise of good, their vision. As they moved through the water, if they looked back, Or if they went, oh my gosh, look at those things, those walls of water, they're going to come in on me any moment at all, they, all would be lost. So it's important that we keep our eye on our vision of who we are in truth and of what we are called to be and do and in the world. And that is how we stay clear of the negative thinking. The negative thinking then has no power over us. And it begins to disappear and fade because we're not feeding it, we're not giving it any attention. Okay, so let's move on to gathering manna. So when the Hebrews finally made it through the water, they're on the other side. They're no longer pursued by the Egyptians. Now they had to figure out how to feed themselves. And again, they moved into a state of fear. Oh my gosh, we're going to starve to death. We want to go back to Egypt. At least we had food there. But Moses, again, in his great wisdom and groundedness in spiritual truth, knew that they would be supplied and sustained. He had already tapped into that idea of God as source. And so what they needed to learn then was to depend on the heavenly realms of the mind, which, remember, it was manna from heaven. Think about that symbolically. Heaven is within us. The kingdom of heaven is within. Jesus taught us that. The kingdom of heaven is within. So the manna from heaven is from the divine within. It's from our states of mind. So as they began to learn that God was their source instead of the Egyptians of their food, they began to experience this thing called manna from heaven. And there are all kinds of theories on what that manna really is. I actually look it up online in Wikipedia. It's really interesting. They think it could be lichen, it could be, all different kinds of things that's available that would provide nutrition. It doesn't matter. The point is that this was a period of time of the Israelites learning to depend on the source, the true source of all that is, which is the presence of God, instead of something outside themselves, and to establish a strong prosperity consciousness then that would carry them through all the way to the promised land eventually. So how do we gather manna then? That's the big question. How do we stay grounded in God is my source? One of the key things is to use what you have. What do you have already? What is your skill? What is your talent? What are things that you have in your possession that you can use to generate the manna? And manna, by the way, stands for any needed sustenance that seems miraculously supplied. So we can do it through powerful decrees, prosperity decrees that I just talked about. God is my source and supply and substance. I am richly supplied. And we'll actually have an experience of that in just a moment. But also we gather manna by you know what, I want to tell a quick little story about that Catherine Ponder offered in her book about using what you have. She talked about a maid who was bitter, angry, having health issues, and was given a book on prosperity laws and the prosperity secrets, and she began to practice them. And she came up with the idea of, oh, that's right, I have this old piece of furniture that's covered over by paint. You know what? It might be an antique. So she went with her little bit of money, got some paint remover and some new stain, and cleaned it all off. And sure enough, it was a very expensive antique that somebody had just given her. And she sold it, made a nice amount of money, and started doing this, refinishing furniture over and over again. And eventually opened up an antique shop and became a very wealthy woman. So the point is we have all kinds of talents and gifts at hand that we can use if we listen to the guidance within of what is our source of substance. Remember, it comes from within, but there are ideas that support us in living prosperous lives. We already talked about do something fearless. Bless everything. My sister just recently was reading Catherine Ponder, and she said, you know what? I'm going to start blessing all of my customers. She's a hairdresser, and she had lost quite a few of her customers. And she says, I'm going to start blessing them. And I said, good idea, and let me know how that works. So you bless what you have instead of thinking that, oh, something's missing. You bless what you have. You bless your money, you bless your clients, you bless your friends. We're blessing our congregation. We bless everything. We also bless our wilderness experiences, knowing that they are catalysts that are motivating us to have a deeper connection with God and to demonstrate our divinity in this world. So we even bless our challenges. Every time we bless, our good multiplies. Every time we bless something. If instead of envy, we bless another's prosperity, there's another one, another type of blessing to do, and it multiplies our own. Okay, and so I have one final story for you. There was a woman who had, this is a Catherine Ponder story. There was a woman that Catherine Ponder knew who had several $100s in bills due. She realized that she had to do something fearless. She had been studying prosperity principles. She had $10 left in her checking account. She wrote out a check giving this amount to her church. It was a faith offering. And she said to her friend, I am going to demonstrate the prosperity of the divine itself, all that I need, because I do the fearless thing. I had given, so I have opened the door to receive. So soon what happened is that she received $400 for some work that she had done months earlier, for which she had never been paid. So there are all these beautiful little stories in Catherine Ponder's book of how people applied these principles, and in this case, fearlessness, to open herself to receive more of the good that the universe, that spirit is providing her. So here's our chance to practice it. So perhaps you have your own Red Sea financial situation or relationship situation or health situation, and you need to gather manna. So let's practice the prosperity law of fearlessness right now by closing our eyes. Get a mental image of the challenge that you face. It can be any type of image at all. So face it and say out loud with me, you don't scare me.
You don't scare me.
Now stretch forth your hand, your great rod of power, lift it upward. And we're now going to part the waters of this challenge with this affirmative prayer, keeping your eyes closed, your other hand on your heart. Divine substance supports me now.
Divine substance supports me now.
Divine substance is the one and only reality in this situation.
Divine substance is the one and only reality in this situation.
Because God is my source.
Because God is my source.
Divine substance is available and doing bountiful work.
Divine substance is available and doing bountiful work.
Right here and right now.
Right here and right now.
Knowing this, I have faith in my every need.
Knowing this, I have faith in my every need.
Let me say that again. Knowing this, I have faith my every need is met.
Knowing this, I have faith my every need is met.
I use what I have.
I use what I have.
And my good multiplies.
And my good multiplies.
I bless what I have.
I bless what I have.
And my good multiplies.
And my good multiplies.
Instead of envy,
Instead of envy,
I bless the prosperity of others.
I bless the prosperity of others.
And my good multiplies.
And my good multiplies.
I do the fearless thing.
I do the fearless thing.
And my good multiplies.
And my good multiplies.
I have fearless faith
I have fearless faith
that every need is now met.
that every need is now met.
I give thanks for my abundance
I
now.
give thanks for my abundance now.
And so it is.
And so it is.
Thank you.